It's great to be here. I'm hoping to learn a lot in the next 2 days, and I'm really pleased I get my presentation over first, so then I can enjoy the rest of the conference. So I agreed to speak on 30 years of thinking on gender and macroeconomics. So I want to begin with the strategic silence of macroeconomics that was identified in a pioneering publication just over 30 years ago, edited by Isa Bakker, called The Strategic Silence, Gender and Economic Policy, including contributions from myself, from Karen Grown, who will be speaking on Saturday, and our dear friend Nilofer Shartai, who, had she not tragically died so young in December of 2022, would have been here, I'm sure, and I'd like to dedicate my presentation to her. So the components of the strategic silence: that macroeconomics treated labor as a non-produced factor of production and households as merely consumption units. It ignored unpaid work, gender divisions of labor, and inequalities within households. And I argued that this silence underpinned macroeconomic policies that disadvantaged women, especially poor women, which I analyzed in my book on male bias in the development process. However, the silence was broken 30 years ago with this special issue of World Development in November 1995 on gender adjustment and macroeconomics, edited by Shartai, Elson and Grown. It had contributions from both feminist and heterodox economists, and it distinguished 4 approaches to gender-aware macroeconomic modeling: gender disaggregation of existing macro variables such as labor, recognition that macro parameters such as productivity and marginal propensity to consume and save are shaped by gender inequality and the gender distribution of income and other resources, the introduction of the unpaid economy, and models that combine 2 or more of these methods. And our aim was to consider not only the impact of macroeconomic policy on gender equality outcomes, but also the impact of gender equality or inequality on macroeconomic policy outcomes. So we said to people, you don't have to be interested in outcomes for women. If you're interested in the impact of macroeconomic policy, you have to think about these gender equality issues. And 3 other landmark special issues since then I just want to signal: a subsequent issue of World Development in 2000 on growth, trade and finance and gender equality, one in Feminist Economics in 2013 on perspectives on a financial and economic crisis, edited by 3 contributors to gender and macroeconomics who are not with us today, Sakiko Fukuda-Parr, James Heinz, and Stephanie Seguino. And more recently, Feminist Economics in 2022 on rethinking macroeconomic modeling of gender and care, edited by Robert Blecker and Alyssa Braunstein, who very much are here today, and including contributions by Ursula and some of her colleagues. So, having introduced that, I want to briefly spend a few minutes talking about the impact of macroeconomics and narrowing this down to consideration of a citation analysis that's been carried out and is about to be published by Günzeli Berek and Ebru Konga on the rise of feminist macroeconomics, who's recognizing in this forthcoming Edward Elgar Handbook on Women and Heterodox Economics. Günzeli and Ebru examine citations in economic journals of myself, of Nilofer Shartai and Karen Grown, of Alyssa Braunstein and Stephanie Seguino, up to May 2024. They found there were 2,240 citations, fewer citations in economic journals than in other disciplines. Within economics, more citations in mainstream journals than in heterodox journals. and about a third of the citations in mainstream journals were those focusing on economic development. All 5 of us have worked a lot on economic development issues. But that really intrigued me. I mean, there are limitations to citation analysis, I'm not denying that, but it was very interesting to me and to others who read this that within economics there were more citations in mainstream journals than heterodox journals, something that gives us pause for thought. So if I turn a little bit now to the impact in heterodox journals, they found they'd included 40 heterodox journals in their analysis, which accounted for 17% of all those citations. But of those, 44% are in feminist economics. Surprise, surprise. 40% are in interdisciplinary heterodox economics journals, which have a broader canvas, and only 16% were in heterodox macroeconomics journals. So heterodox macroeconomics journals accounted for only 2% of the social total citations, and half of those were in 3 journals. I give them honorable mention here at the bottom of the slide. So that really made me intrigued. Why is this the case? And it's something I'd like to discuss afterwards in the dinner and so forth with anybody who's interested. So these are some first thoughts on why this conceptual silence in heterodox macroeconomics. After all, economists at the IMF concluded that gender equality is, quote, a macro-critical issue, although this hasn't made really any changes to IMF policy. And I think under the onslaught of the Trump government, they've stopped talking about gender now. It's a forbidden word. But my concern was what's holding back the recognition by heterodox economists, with some honorable exceptions. So I'm going to suggest that one problem may be a focus on full employment that takes for granted the supply of labor and only problematizes the demand for labor. I'm not saying we shouldn't problematize the demand for labor, of course we should, but we should also recognize that full employment does not guarantee well-being, and that unemployment does not capture many dimensions of ill-being. And there's a need to go beyond the full employment, unemployment focus and include the reproduction of the labor force and treat labor as endogenous, not exogenous. So that means we problematize the supply of labor as well as the demand for labor. So let me say a little bit more about the reproduction of the labor force. There's the reproduction of the labor force intergenerationally, which is questions about that come more to the fore now with demographic changes and fertility falling below replacement rate in many, many countries, but I haven't got time to talk about that today. I'm going to focus on the reproduction of the labor force on a day-to-day basis, the renewal of capabilities of what Marx called labor power, the physical and mental health, the knowledge and the skills, and the cooperative abilities of people. This requires sustaining investment of both paid and unpaid labor by private, public, household, and not-for-profit sectors. And without sustaining investment, capabilities, I'm going to argue, are depleted, reducing both well-being and output. And I would recommend you all take a look at James Heinz's book called The Economies Other Half, How Taking Gender Seriously Transforms Macroeconomics. It is available, free to download from the publisher's website. And I want to emphasize that market forces are unable to guarantee this sustaining investment. The reproduction of labor force is a contradictory and uncertain process. And now I'm going to put up this diagram because I've always been fond of what Joan Robinson called the pre-analytic vision, the understanding before you write any equations of how do you think the economy works and what do you think are the key components of the economy. And this is a diagram I've used quite a lot in teaching. Let's see how it goes today. This focuses on the circular flow of money, but also of labor. It argues that we look at the economy composed of 4 sectors: The private sector at the top of the diagram to signal its dominance, the household sector at the bottom of the diagram to signal its foundational position, the public sector and the not-for-profit or NGO sector in the middle as they try to counteract the dominance of the private sector and support the household sector. And this diagram suggests there is production going on in all of these sectors. The household sector is a productive sector where unpaid care and subsistence work takes place. And this is the unpaid work that's important for reproducing the labor force, for sending those little people out on the diagram, out on those arrows to supply the other sectors. And the private sector, in return, supplies money and commodities to the other sectors. I don't have time to go into all the detail of these interactions, but I do want to focus on that bit at the bottom of the slide that's called depletion of human capabilities. Because this is to signal that this circular flow isn't something that gets reproduced unproblematically. It has breaks, it has contradictions, it has crises. And one of those breaks, contradictions, and crises, one of the things that results in is the depletion of human capabilities, signaled by those two people lying collapsed on their sides at the bottom and not participating in the flow of labor to the rest of the economy. I want to then talk about fiscal consolidation. What happens when the public sector, in the middle of the diagram, the government decides to undertake a program of fiscal consolidation? The obvious and important immediate impact is on paid employment and income. The loss of public services and income transfers, the loss of paid employment directly in the public sector, indirectly in the private sector through multiplier effects, the loss of disposable income through reduction in income transfers and paid employment and through increases in taxes. Now, mainstream economists argue that these negative impacts are short-lived and the cuts will lead to growth through private investment. We probably all think this is a fairy tale, and heterodox economists argue that cuts don't lead to growth and that unemployment persists. Feminist economists go beyond that to argue that the loss of jobs, services, and incomes tends to affect women more than men, particularly with poor women worst affected, and also that to look at the full impact, we must go beyond the paid economy and to look at unpaid work. So if we look at the short-run impact of fiscal consolidation on unpaid work, it produces a pressure to provide more unpaid work. In volunteer work, in NGOs, to provide replacement services when public services are closed or deteriorate. In care and subsistence work in households, to stretch income further. There's a phrase in English, make do and mend. We should make do and mend, and then we'll get through this crisis. But make do and mend requires more unpaid work. To cook more from scratch, to repair clothes, for instance. And then more unpaid work to try and provide care lost from the deterioration, cuts to public services. And also things that are often overlooked, queuing to access public services and food banks. Is this unpaid work a safety net of last resort, which will be provided out of love and therefore can be disregarded by economists? It will continue, it will be provided, and this will tide us all through the bad times of the fiscal consolidation. And it's not tracked, what's happening to it, because of lack of regular time use surveys. Nothing like the kind of timely statistics we have on paid labor. We don't have that to give the full picture of labor, both unpaid as well as paid. So then I want to identify the impact on the reproduction of the labor force and highlight the depletion of human capabilities. More unpaid work often leads to stress and physical and mental ill health for those trying to provide it. There's a very interesting recent study in the British Medical Journal, which brings together and reviews a lot of the evidence on this in the recent period, I think, during and since COVID, about documenting the adverse impact on women's well-being of extra unpaid work. And of course, more unpaid work cannot make good all the losses of public services, the losses of youth clubs, libraries, community services, teaching assistants, care assistants. There's a limit to the substitutability of unpaid work for paid work. And more unpaid work cannot make good all the losses of income. Child poverty increases, health, nutrition, and learning of children deteriorate. So the safety net provided by unpaid work has many, many holes. And there's no limit, and there's a limit to what can be achieved by care in an uncaring world. Well, this has long-run economic impacts. Productivity increases are held back. And productivity does matter for free time and well-being, although we have to be very careful how productivity is measured, because things that actually reduce the quality of services and intensify the exploitation of labor are often mislabeled as increases in productivity. So we certainly have to be careful about that. But I think we're interested in increasing productivity, not necessarily so we can have more, but we can spend less time producing it. Labor force participation is reduced. I don't know about other countries, but in the UK, there's been a big increase in people not in employment, education, or training, the so-called NEETs. Demands on sickness and incapacity benefits rise. Demands for health and care services rise. Cooperation is undermined. Violence and social disorder rise, as we're seeing all around Europe. Now, incorporating the unpaid economy into the analysis helps reveal the false economies of expenditure cuts that will damage economic growth and improvements in well-being. And the unpaid work, the extra unpaid work, cannot make good all of this damage. So what do we need? Better modeling of macroeconomic policy. And I think we're going to hear lots of examples of progress we're making towards that in this conference. Introduce an unpaid work sector, recognize the positive and the negative feedback effects of unpaid work on both the quantity and the quality of labor supply of both caregivers and care receivers. Recognize that labor is a produced input and requires investment to sustain its capabilities. Recognize that expenditure cuts have long-lasting, not just short-run impacts, and can permanently deplete capabilities. Recognize that spending on public services, such as health, care, and education, is an investment in social infrastructure, that will enhance productivity and growth prospects. And take a longer-run perspective. The gains from investment may not be immediate. In the UK, the Office of Budget Responsibility, which produces forecasts and monitors fiscal policy, thinks that positive multiplier impacts stop after 5 years. So anything that's going to have a longer-term impact, like many of the investments in social infrastructure, is just by assumption ruled out when making the forecasts. And treat well-being rather than full employment or GDP as the ultimate objective. So those are the kind of suggestions I want to make to you, and I'm going to make way for my fellow panelists now. I just want to say I've been drawing upon arguments and ideas that are brought together in this new book I've published on gender and development and macroeconomic policy. The introduction is new, reflecting on these 30 years of experience, and many of the chapters are all republications of somewhat hard to access papers is available open access, and I think it might be a resource to consider for any of you teaching these kind of courses. So thank you.